Greeting, friends. All summer long, Disciples Justice Ministries will be sharing a series of conversations between justice leaders under the theme Facing Brokenness, Being Brave Together. There will be 4 conversations total, each one focusing on a particular topic: the church, our communities, the world, and creation. We have already shared the conversations on the church and our communities. Tonight's conversation will be centered around the world. My name is Lori Poundfell, and in addition to being the senior pastor of First Christian Church Minneapolis, the founder and co-facilitator of Disciples Public Presence, I am also the co-facilitator for the Disciples Justice Ministries cohort group, along with my friend and colleague, Reverend Brian Frederick Gray. This series of conversations comes out of work that we've been doing all year long, striving to address the dual threats of online radicalization and white nationalism. Those conversations started up in our group in late 2020, and following the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021, we redoubled our efforts. In this conversation, you'll be hearing our panelists reflect on where they see brokenness, what can happen to bring about wholeness, and where they are finding hope right now. Tonight's panel includes Jeff Wright from Disciples Palestine Israel Network, Natalie Teague, who is the Refugee and Immigration Ministries Legal Counsel, and Marco Cable, Global Ministries Africa Area Executive. Make sure to stick around to the very end of the video because we'll have a tangible takeaway that you can do to help make a difference in the world as we work to be brave together. In fact, we have one of those Being Brave Together sections at the end of each video in this series. Now, on behalf of your siblings in faith at Disciples Justice Ministries, welcome to the conversation. Without further ado, let's get to that opening question. Where do you see brokenness?
So there are many places where I have witnessed brokenness in our world, but these last year or so of being in the global pandemic has really shown our deep brokenness in our world, in our country, in our communities. The global pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of our systems around the world. It has reminded us that we have so much to do to bring wholeness, because inequality still exists in us and among us. We learned over the 4th of July weekend that the United States did not reach President Biden's 70% goal of the population being fully vaccinated. But failure to meet this goal is a result of people choosing not to be vaccinated. In the United States, we have the privilege to decide to be vaccinated or not. And it's also true that poor and middle income countries worldwide have not reached their goals. But there is a glooming contrast because most people in poor and middle income countries have been denied, or they faced mostly financial obstacles to accessing vaccines. The pandemic has exposed and intensified brokenness within and between countries. According to our World in Data, more than 3.32 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses have been administered worldwide. 27.4% of the world population has received at least 1 dose of the vaccine, but only 1% of people in low-income countries have received 1 dose. This creates deep brokenness in the human family. This great chasm between the wealthier and poor nations is so pronounced. It has reminded us that we still have so much to do to bring wholeness to our broken world because inequalities exist in us and among us. And the pandemic has also shown us that money controls narratives. I think that's part of the reason why we are not hearing these disparities in getting vaccinations around the world, but we continue to, in some ways, obsess with our people being protected. Money continues to decide who has access and who does not. And this has come to the forefront in the distribution of COVID vaccines. So right now, my mind is really thinking about the brokenness in the human family, how nations are deciding we're going to take care of ourselves and allow you to fend for your community, for your citizens. And the fact that we're even debating to share vaccines or not also reveals deep brokenness in our human family.
I want to piggyback off on that it is such a huge sign of injustice and inequality and inequities worldwide that there is the choice to vaccinate or not, and the fact that they're here in the United States and that in many other parts of the world, it is not possible to choose to be vaccinated, right? The priorities or the age ranges have not arrived yet. So I specifically, what comes to mind for me is working with a family that was from Mexico, trying to get some family members here before an elder passed, and very extraordinary circumstances. But essentially through it, I learned that, Mexico just now, I'm talking the end of June, beginning of July 2021, is just starting to vaccinate its population in the ranges of 40 and 50 years old. So, given Mexico's population statistics, that means that the vast majority of the population is yet to actually hit the number where they can actually, show up to be vaccinated. And that's a really stark contrast to what we're seeing here in the United States, right? Like here in the United States, yes, we did not meet the 70% goal that President Biden had set, but at the same time, anyone over the age of 12, essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but anyone over the age of 12 can go and as an adult or with their parent and receive a vaccination. And that's just not how it is throughout the rest of the world. And so as immigration counsel to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, I'm seeing that as an enormous challenge, as an enormous amount of brokenness, because our immigration system was already broken previously. Our immigration system was originally laid out in a statute from 1952. So next year, our original immigration statute, or the one that's in force now, next year it will be 70 years old. Just imagine how much the world has changed in 70 years, how much technology has changed, how much more of a globalized society we are, and we're still operating in a 70-year-old framework. It was amended so the INA came down in 1952. It was amended in 1965. So, the amendments that we're working off of, those are also 56 years old. We're talking before the internet. We're talking about before going to the moon. And so I see brokenness in our world and our immigration system every day in all of the cases that I handle, whether they are family-based, whether they are employment-based, whether they are humanitarian-based. COVID has made this so much more of a challenge, so much worse than it already was. Just to give some context to that, religious worker cases that I'm handling as part of my role as immigration counsel, the immigrant petitions were taking between 5 to 7 months when the pandemic started in March of 2020. Last week, the processing times were updated. They are now taking 20 to 26 months. So in other words, processing times that were already lengthy and difficult have increased by 3 to 4 to 5 times what they were before the pandemic. I also see huge ramifications for folks who are abroad and who are trying to either come to a job, come to reunite with family, come to go to the school here in the United States, because our consulates have been closed or they have been operating at very, very minimal capacity for emergencies only, for U.S. citizen entry only, for the past 16 months. And so what this looks like right now is, for example, families that are trying to emigrate from Mexico are looking at having a 2-year wait time just to get their consulate interview scheduled, because the backlog is so intensive. Essentially, there's an entire 16 months of processing that has not occurred in any kind of regular fashion. And so that has compounded, and we're really at a point where people can't plan their lives. Families have been separated for periods of 16 months if they've left the country and got stuck abroad and have not been able to come back. Folks that have already been waiting for a long time to get their petitions or have their applications adjudicated are having to wait even longer. And really, it is one of the most challenging times that I've seen as an immigration practitioner. So Jeff, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, COVID, I guess I'm taking a kind of a macro view on the lack of distribution of the COVID vaccination, as well as food distribution around the world. And I would point as one of those bigger issues of the brokenness is just this unfettered capitalism that we're experiencing in the US and around the world, and the effects of that, which include the environmental crises we're facing now and all the rest. A second, I guess I would point to evidence of that brokenness is just the legacy of settler colonialism and how we're experiencing that in so many different parts of the world. I'm serving for Global Ministries as a global service worker appointed to Palestine, and I see that in the folks that are suffering under that occupation. It's really the result of a settler colonialism rooted in Zionism, but we're experiencing that with the indigenous peoples in our own country, all the way to Australia and the indigenous people there. A second sign of the brokenness or experience of the brokenness, I guess I'm concerned about that growing authoritarianism that we're seeing in so many nations around the world too, and evidence of that right here in the US as well. But as by way of confession, I guess I want to start with myself. John Meacham was on Fareed Zakaria's GPS this past Sunday, and I love Meacham, but he was talking about the struggle for justice, and I actually wrote this down, and equality, and a history of which we can be proud is a daily one, that struggle in everybody's soul. And he went on to say that he said that the soul of a person, I believe, is not all good or all bad, but is an arena of contention in which the worst instincts do battle against our better angels. He has a great way of putting stuff. And then he didn't want to call Fareed into this, and I wouldn't call you all into this either, but he says, I know my worst instincts win a hell of a lot more than my better angels. And I guess that brokenness begins in our own human heart. Solzhenitsyn said there's a line that goes right down the middle of it, dividing good from evil. So that struggle there, just a recognition of that and a naming of that helps me be a little more patient and a little more hope-filled as well as we are facing that brokenness that we've named.
Every day we have to choose a different path, a different way. We choose to love and to forgive versus to hold grudges and to hate. And also, I think in part of what we're doing now is that we're choosing to speak versus to be silent. Because although I recognize deep brokenness within me and I can witness brokenness in the world, I can get into a place where I go within and only tend to myself and allow the world to fall apart or go to war and kill itself and continue to harm one another. But I also at the same time recognize that it is a dual struggle. It is dealing with the individual, but also daring to confront the evil and the brokenness in the world and to continue to commit myself to working towards wholeness in some small ways, but also in larger ways of building coalitions. But I also think that the conversation is so important because many of the things that we're speaking about, we just don't know. If you don't know how to do an advanced Google search and you don't know where to find the resources, it's like I'm living my best life and I never know what my neighbor next door or my neighbor across the ocean is experiencing.
Natalie, how do you work toward wholeness?
One of the things that when I was a younger attorney in other times and in roles, I just worked harder and harder and harder, right? And just tried to thinking that would somehow meet something. And one of the things that I've learned over time in my experience is that if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're not starting with ourselves, we're not going to create change for anyone else or with anyone else or for anyone else. And so one of the big shifts for me in terms of being able to do the work and trying to work towards wholeness is kind of incorporating and creating this kind of very deliberate system, acts, time that I have to engage in every day to be able to continue to do the work and do it well. And so in preparation for this, I was trying to think of like how I would distill that down, and I came up with kind of something cute and catchy. So hopefully it's not too corny. It's not an acronym, but it's encouraging people to get MNOPQ. So like going down the alphabet. And so the first thing is to get moving. For me, I have to get moving. I have to, whether it's walking, whether it's hiking, whether it's dance, whether it's yoga, I've got to move my body. And it's something that I've got to do to get the things out, right? So that's N. The N is to get noisy. The noisy, sometimes it's to make a joyful noise for when there are triumphs, or to make a not so joyful noise when things get tough. And so that can look like, literally just sometimes screaming out loud into a pillow, or screaming out loud at the sky, all the way to turning on my favorite music and just jamming out no matter how horrible my singing is. So I'd encourage that. The O is to get outside, because getting outside, finding some way to connect with nature, it's easier in some places more than others. But what I always come back to is that we all, or most of all of us, are going to always have access to the sky, to the sun, to the stars, to the clouds. And so I think that is just, for me, getting outside is a huge part of self-care and working towards wholeness. So that's O. P is for patient, and to be patient and to be peaceful, right? I keep trying to think that, we are not the first people to struggle with all of these issues. Systemic racism has been here for over 400 years in this country, right? Climate change is not something that just came about yesterday. There are people who have come before us who have made these struggles. And so, I know a lot of us are sick and tired of being sick and tired, but it's important to remember that we have to keep that patience and keep that hope, and try to arrive at some peace with that. Q is getting quiet. And getting quiet and getting mindful, and taking the time for meditation, taking the time for prayer, taking the time to go inside and to shut everything else out, and to try to bring my mind down to a period of stillness. And sometimes that's really, really hard. I won't lie. Sometimes it's really, really hard. But I always find, if I'm having a really challenging day, a really challenging case, a really challenging situation, even if it's 5 minutes, that period of quiet and stillness, it makes everything go smoother.
Natalie, I love it. Get moving, make noise, get outside. I'm going to get the P here, just a second.
Patient.
Yeah. And then be quiet. Yeah. Good. Thanks. I serve with Marla Schrader as co-coordinator for Disciples Palestine Israel Network. DPIN is what we call it. It's a resource and an advocacy group. It's one of many Disciples Justice Network partners that are working in DPIN's case to encourage disciples to advocate for human rights and the application of international law, specifically for DPIN in the Middle East. I'm also serving then as a global service worker appointed to Kairos Palestine, which is a Christian organization officed in Bethlehem, which is seeking to get the word out about, and then also to nonviolently resist the now over 50-year brutal occupation of Israel. So I work in communications there. I write, I edit, I speak to groups. And as I say, people say you're a global mission worker, but you're at your desk in Colorado. And yeah, I spent a lot of time doing those tasks. But my wife and I also host alternative tours to the Middle East. So we go to Palestine and Israel and see the holy sites, and also spend half that time meeting with Jews and Muslims and Christians to talk about the situation, and especially meeting with those organizations that are working for a just peace there. And I guess that meaning and purpose too getting expressed in the local church here to participate in a congregation that's figured out ways to be at work in the community to seek also justice locally.
I think that's great, Jeff. I have found so much meaning being connected to the church. My early ministry as a local church pastor, in the last 7 years of serving as the area executive for Africa in Global Ministries. And Natalie, thank you so much. I love to be part of conversations when people bring up such insight. I never would have thought to think about the alphabet and come up with such inspiring words to correspond with those letters. But one that I'm thinking about is C. So talking about getting out of the alphabet soup is C, is to remember to celebrate. This work can be very overwhelming. And sometimes you just keep walking through the tunnel hoping that there's light, because light is not visible. And so as you take each step, when there's a victory, it is important to celebrate the victory. I'm reminded in a recent conversation with the president of the United Theological College in Zimbabwe, we were corresponding about the third wave of COVID in the country, which has really restricted movement. And so he was talking about how, again, the school has closed down and people are struggling, especially the church and institutions of higher learning and also primary schools. And he had wrote all of these sad statistics and realities. And he said, but I thank God that we were able to set up our online learning platform. So now that we're going back into level 3 and our students are unable to return to campus, we have a platform in place to continue training leaders for the Church of Jesus Christ. And you know, we don't know how long level 3 lockdown is going to, how long it's going to be in Zimbabwe. But what we know is that our partner organization can continue its work because of the accompaniment of faithful members of our church through Global Ministries has been able to walk with them and establish an online platform. And although they are being challenged, not only through the pandemic, but politically, we know that work in ministry continues, and we must stop and pause and to celebrate the C, Natalie, the C, to celebrate.
I love the C, Marco. That's great. And it's especially important because there are a lot of setbacks in the work that any of us are doing. So to stop and celebrate even the little step forward is so important because we hit a lot of walls. It's long haul work. I think of God, who I think the scientists tell us our universe is over 50 billion years old. So I've always thought God has to be in the long haul process. God knows what God's doing and what God's going to bring to completion, as we're reminded in the scripture. But boy, God is a lot more patient than I am. So to celebrate the victories, and then I would add an R, Natalie, to the Q, and that's to rest, to make sure that we're taking time to play and to renew ourselves. So either rest or renewal would be the word there.
Where do you see hope?
I want to point to young adults, and specifically young adults in historic Palestine, but really young adults all around the world. You know, I'm just seeing in so many corners of the world, they're not just resisting the challenges that they're facing, and in the case of Palestine, the occupation under which they've been raised now, they're also fighting for human rights and human dignity. And also in Palestine and in other places around the world, they're fighting for democracy that's been denied to them, in the case of the Palestinians by Israel and also by the Palestinian regime. I'm just excited that there's a new fire that's burning in our young adults here at home, as well as around the world. And I guess another place I would see hope is a growing awareness, especially in relationship again to where I'm serving on the part of Americans and in Congress, of this decades-long injustice that Palestinians have faced and our role as taxpayers in the United States in that occupation. I'll point to, and I think you two might be able, Natalie and Marco, to speak a little bit more to this, but to this growing recognition that the movements for human rights and human dignity around the world are really finding a commonality now in their struggles for justice. There's a coming together, a global coming together. Kairos Palestine, for example, the organization that I serve, wrote a letter of support for Black Lives Matter this past summer. And there was an historic Hispanic labor organization up in the Northeast that wrote a letter in support of the Palestinian cry for hope, a call to decisive action. That's exciting to see. And the movement of that's happening in social media has become so important too. Voices that are denied in our major media are getting heard in other ways.
I'll look at that entirely. I think that in talking about the struggle for international human rights, it was in previous contexts, it had kind of been this whole, oh, we have to secure international human rights or human rights outside of the United States. And there wasn't really much talk about what human rights look like here at home. And we're not there anymore, right? Like we are, I feel like for the first time, we're really actually engaged in the conversation of what are human rights, what is human dignity, what does that look like in various contexts? What does that look like here in the United States? What does that look like abroad? What does that look like if you're an immigrant? What does that look like for various different contexts that people are living in? And really, quite honestly, that is what gives me a huge amount of hope, because it seemed like for a really, really long time that there were those of us that had our issues that we worked on and we were concerned about, and we would be concerned about them, and we would be asking people to get up and do things, and sometimes shouting and screaming and begging for help and for change. But that it wasn't a big common conversation that we were seeing out in social media, because social media didn't exist, or something that we were seeing in national news. And we're beyond that now. This is an integrated part of our conversations. People don't have email signatures anymore without including their pronouns. That is a huge step forward from where we have been in the past. We are finally really beginning to grapple with race issues. We've got a really, 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 really long way to go. But it is, when we're starting to see large corporations, maybe not always making the best efforts or making the strongest efforts, but at least the fact that there are these conversations being had on multiple different levels of multiple different agents of change, that is progress. That is moving the needle forward, albeit even if it's little bits here and there.
So I want to put in a word for Global Ministries, because I really do think that the renewal of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ lies in mission, whether that's here in your own community or it's in your area, or national movements or global movements. When we get people out in the community, out serving, outside the church's walls, they're bound to come back, because that's where they want to find some meaning and purposes in a faith that is involved in service. So I've been saying for several years that I really do believe that renewal of disciples is in mission, and Global Ministries offers so many of those opportunities to be out there, experience it, and then come home changed, having been served when we think we're serving, and changed when we think we're bringing change. So thanks God for our Global Ministries.
And we thank God for your faithful service, Jeff. You really make a difference, and you're able to connect the dots for us. I continue to be inspired, like much of what you said, that both of you said, you and Jeff and Natalie, on an international movement. It's not so localized anymore, but the connection. So, lately, the new name is George Floyd, but not so long ago, it was Michael Brown. And around the time that Michael Brown was murdered, I had the privilege of traveling to the Middle East. And I met young people with signs that said Black Lives Matter. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It was just so shocking to me. I was not prepared for it. That was not part of the orientation. And what through conversations with these young people, they began to make the connection between what was happening to Black young men in the United States to their experience as Palestinians, and being in a place where those who are being paid to protect you are instead terrorizing you. And so it is powerful for me to see intersectional work, because Dr. King told us a long time ago that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And in order for us to move forward in a more loving, just, equitable society, we must join our voices and efforts to rout out all injustice. And so I think the young people have gotten it. Social media, which I hear is so much more than Facebook, but all of the social media platforms that, things can happen and we can see it in real times. And sometimes it is things we rather not see because we rather sanitize stories. But we can see it in real time because of this thing called a cell phone and a camera, and the movement starts. And what I like about it is that we're moving beyond a charismatic leader. We're moving beyond a charismatic leader, that there's more collaboration. There are people who are able to recognize their strengths and their weaknesses, and they are not afraid to say, this is what I do well. And so this is my lane and I'm going to do this thing. And I know you have a really gifts for this, and I'm going to allow you to do it. And we're just going to come together, and we're going to believe that the pieces are going to fall where they're supposed to fall. I am so inspired by our young people. And Jeff, I completely agree with you that I believe it's missions that's going to keep the church alive. It is that's going to infuse hope and connectiveness within the life of the church. I'm not necessarily sure that people are going to return to the building. I think people are going to be connected to church because of the community that it offers, that it's going to be a community that is outwardly focused, a community that's able to join hands with people who are so unlike you, but it's a diverse community. It's an open community. It's a community that allows different people to sit at the table together, to strategize together, to fight together, and to pray and to rest together.
We are extolling the virtues of youth. You can see I'm the only gray hair here. I want to say that there are many, many opportunities for those of us with gray hair to find places in mission in our local community and to find that meaning and purpose. And I'm 71 years old and going to be at it. I pray until they lay me to rest. But I think one of the most important things we can do too is to support our youth, to go with our youth. We have what I would describe as a young pastor in our congregation, and everything she suggests, I say, let's go for it. And we have a congregation that's been real responsive that way too. So one of our roles, I think, is as older members of the church is to make sure we're not standing in the way, but that we're providing avenues even for our young people to lead out into the community and within the church itself.
I think it's just important to recognize that that the framework of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is pretty phenomenal in the sense that there's such diversity and so much such a deep reach to the various missions and ministries. I will throw out there that my position as of immigration counsel, of being an immigration attorney on staff within a denomination is incredibly rare. I really have to say that this is something that is really remarkable and worth lauding and worth really cherishing, because many denominations will engage in advocacy for immigrants and refugees, which is incredibly necessary. And my colleague, Reverend Dr. Sharon Stanley Ray, honestly, her work is very powerful, and I plan to speak about that later. But to actually have an attorney be able to provide legal advice, provide legal representation in certain cases, I have gathered with other attorneys that do religious worker cases, and I've come to realize that my position is really one of less than a handful of positions throughout all denominations in the United States. And so I just want to say that I think that one of the things that has really inspired me about this particular denomination, about this particular work, is that it's not just talk. There is a ton of walking going on, and that is something to really, that is something that I think has been around for a while, and so that is worth applauding older generations and folks that put these frameworks into place. So just to add that in.
No, Natalie, I'm grateful for your work. I am grateful to be part of a church that has created such a place for an immigration attorney to be part of our structure, and is able to sit at the table, and you have the skills and the passion to represent us well. And for that, I'm grateful. I will like to just kind of encourage those who are listening to seek out the many resources that we have throughout the life of our church. We have a lot of good work that is going on your behalf, and this is a wonderful time to commit to doing your part. And notice, it's not a one size fit all. You may be just comfortable writing a letter to your representative, and there are resources on websites to help you with those letters. Or perhaps you feel comfortable calling your congressperson or your senator's offices to share your passion about issues that we've raised here, or things that you're aware of in your local community or the global community. I would strongly encourage you to get involved, get your women's fellowship group involved, get the retired ministers or the Ministers Association, the youth group, and even our Cairo students, young people, children to be involved. That we all have a part to play. We're not all called to do the same thing, but we are all called to be faithful in the work that we are we're doing together to bring about God's justice and God's reign here on earth. So that would be my input. But no, I'm just very grateful to be part of a church that's even having this conversation. I am really inspired by the conversation that we're having, and I hope that these conversations can continue. And that we recognize that it's not a political issue, but it is a faith issue, that Jesus calls us into these spaces and calls us to be advocates and calls us to the margins.
There's a movement for justice that's growing around the world. And if you've tuned into this conversation, you're part of that movement.
Being brave together. Thank you to Marco and Jeff and Natalie for this wonderful conversation today. I am Krista Johnson-Weichsel with Global Ministries, here with this week's Being Brave Together segment with ideas of some ways that we can take action in our own lives and continue this conversation from today. I'm especially grateful for what the panelists shared today about the alphabet of self-care. When we were talking about this Facing Brokenness series, it was facing brokenness underpinned by looking at trauma and white supremacy. And they certainly touched on both of those topics, but also the resilience that we need to take care of ourselves and keep doing the work. So I think that in itself could have been our Being Brave Together segment today. But if I could add one more letter to the alphabet, it would be A for advocacy. Our panelists today each shared about how brokenness in the world intersects with the work of their ministries and called on us to choose to speak out rather than staying silent. And one way that we can do that and be in partnership with our global partners around the world is to call on our own government to make changes. So we invite you to call or write to your member of Congress and ask them, as Natalie said, to treat migrants with respect and dignity and to make our voices heard in support of migrants and refugees. And as Marco shared about the inequality of vaccine access, and we ask you to call upon the US government to release vaccines and to support vaccine equity around the world. And Jeff spoke about Israel Palestine, and here we do have a very specific advocacy ask. This past spring, Representative Betty McCollum introduced the Promoting Human Rights for Palestinian Children Living Under Israeli Military Occupation ask in the US House of Representatives. And this bill notes that child detention by the Israeli military courts violate international laws and standards of human rights and is contrary to American values and undermines efforts to promote a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So this bill would seek to prohibit funding for the military detention of children in any country, including Israel, and to provide $19 million for non-governmental organizations monitoring human rights abuses associated with Israel's military detention of children and provisions of physical, psychological, and emotional treatment and support for Palestinian child victims of Israeli military detention, abuse, and torture. So this is very much in line with the resolution that was passed at the 2017 General Assembly advocating for the rights of Palestinian children living under Israeli military occupation. Scripture shows that Jesus privileged children, welcoming them and blessing them. Indeed, God's love was revealed to us in a child. So supporting this bill asserts that we too recognize their blessing and the vulnerability of children and commit to their protection and their rights. So please, we encourage you to contact your representative in the House to support or co-sponsor this bill, and contact your senators and ask them to introduce this bill in the Senate. And you can find more information about how to do all of this in the chat. And to learn more, to find other opportunities to engage in advocacy and to learn more, we'd invite you to subscribe to the Refugee and Immigration Ministries Wrap to receive updates and advocacy opportunities. And as you can tell, we have a wonderful Disciples Immigration Legal Counsel, Natalie Teague, and want you to know that there are pro bono legal consultations for immigration law available with her. And more information is also in the chat about how you can get in touch. We'd also encourage you to subscribe to the Global Ministries Weekly Update, where there's always an advocacy section, and the Disciples Justice Ministries newsletter for more ideas about how we can take action to be brave together.